Let's talk about, well, freedom of speech. Ben Jones is a director of case operations and outreach at the Free Speech Union, I must declare, of which I'm a member and involved in some tenuous way in the organisation. Ben, I wanted to talk to you about Labour making this extraordinary announcement, just a sort of ministerial communique over the weekend, saying that they are abandoning plans for a new law due to come into force, I believe, this week to help protect free speech on campuses. Tell us what's happened.
It's shocking. So we had campaigned for a number of years at the Free Speech Union for the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. This is in response to the deluge of cancel culture that we've all seen at university campuses. We've dealt with more than 500 cases connected with universities in just 4 years. There's a huge problem. It's a huge problem that goes far beyond the headline cases, Kathleen Stock, Selena Todd, and so on. So it was a great victory for freedom of speech, great victory for academic freedom. Really important whether you're in universities or not, because what happens in universities tends to trickle out to the rest of society. So it was a great triumph for everyone on the left, on the right, whatever your political views, who was concerned about freedom of speech. Yeah. And it has more or less been swept away at the stroke of a ministerial pen in a statement.
And it wasn't something that had been announced. This had gone through Parliament, it had gone through the House of Commons, gone through the House of Lords. It had, received Royal Assent. This was going to go ahead.
Correct. Okay. So there was still every prospect, every hope, every assumption that
this would still move. And it had cross-party support by the end as well, certainly in the Lords. And the key thing about this was, although technically speaking there is protection for free speech on campuses, well, clearly the number of cases we've had and number of high-profile cases where we've had students losing their places at university, speakers being cancelled and people being bullied and threatened, and indeed staff actually forced out of their jobs with threats and the like. I mean, it's been absolutely horrific what's been going on. Clearly what we've had isn't working, and this new law would have brought in more protection and the possibility of sort of proper fines on universities. They were going to basically make it a very big penalty for universities that didn't uphold freedom of speech.
That's exactly right. There would have been a complaint scheme. So if you were a visiting speaker or an academic or a student, you could make a complaint if your free speech rights were infringed. Yeah. And universities and student unions would have been required to actively promote freedom of speech. So this is something that would have ushered in a much, much needed cultural change across the higher education sector. Now, we've had this very disappointing news. You'll not be surprised to know that we are now looking at our options. We are taking advice. We will be writing to the Education Secretary very soon. And we think that if the government is of the view that this act that, as you said, had cross-party support by the end, has achieved royal assent, that if it needs to be repealed, really the government ought to have to fight for that. It ought to have to go out there and make the case publicly that the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act is something that is somehow unnecessary, that it should be repealed. It hasn't done that. It hasn't made the case for it. It's tried to sneak this announcement through.
And it's such a worry, isn't it? Because you say it is actually happening on a grand scale, and there's been loads of surveys actually showing that many people just simply, students and academics simply don't speak out publicly because they are afraid that they will themselves be cancelled, and so they're just keeping their mouths shut. And we were told, were we not, that Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, that the culture wars are over, there are no more culture wars. It looks like, hey, we're in a culture war.
I think one of the frustrations I've had about the press coverage has been that it's been described as the Tories' law to protect freedom of speech at universities. If I had £1 for every time I'd spoken to somebody who contacted the Free Speech Union for help and said, I've always been on the left, I don't agree with anything that your boss Toby Young has ever written, but I really need your help. It's a cross-party issue. Freedom of speech is fundamental to our society. And I'm afraid if this is the first thing that the new government has done with respect to freedom of speech, we really do have to worry about what they're going to do next. And we have some idea of this already.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a massive, massive concern. And again, if they're saying there isn't a problem with freedom of speech on campus, well, then the new law isn't a problem, is it? Because well, if it isn't a problem and it was going into place anyway, nothing would change and the universities would act. But again, I first became aware of this really over, the trans issue and women who were simply saying, we're called gender-critical feminists, women just stating biological fact, no hate, nothing, being told that they couldn't possibly be even allowed to give a speech because there would be some trouble. And then we've had, of course, lots of other issues come up as well. But also, we've had the issue of, the pro-Palestine march churches, and concerns about anti-Semitism on campus as well. Now, there's a very thin line between the right of people to give their views and speak freely and have that robust debate, which would have happened when I was at university way back when, as opposed to stopping people from actually physically intimidating people into not speaking up and not having a say at all.
There have been concerns raised by Jewish groups over the weekend who've welcomed the fact that the act is not being commenced. But what I'd say is, look what happened to the Israeli ambassador in 2021 at the London School of Economics, who was chased from the building and hounded. This law should have been a shield that protected everybody and everybody's right to articulate their view, whether you are pro-Israeli or anti.
Absolutely. I remember we spoke to Scipio Hartley-Brewer the day after that. I was absolutely shocked that I was mortified that happened in Britain, actually, to an ambassador from one of our allies. Really appreciate your work on all of this, Ben Jones, and I know that most of the cases that the Free Speech Union deal with never reach the public eye. They're not all over the Twitter, they're not all over the newspapers, and you deal with thousands upon thousands of cases, and so many of them are involved in our universities. So appreciate you joining us, Ben Jones.